If you're looking to enhance your texturing skills with Substance Designer and UE5, this video series is for you. I'll guide you through the process of creating a trim texture set, the one that is used to design this entire environment. With over 10 years of experience creating science fiction games like Destiny and Mass Effect, I'm sharing the techniques that I've been refining throughout the years. And now you can apply them to your own projects. This is the third video of the series where we create our trim texture set in Substance Designer. On the next video, I will show you how to make a material with the variants in UE5. And then I'll walk you through the entire scene that showcases all of our work. We will also review our game-ready 3D models that are made from that trim texture. Thank you for watching. In our original reference, we have very interesting contrasting colors and accents. As I've been modeling, I was placing different colors in different sections, thinking about this as well. I would encourage you to consider which materials do you want to use. Painted metal, dark versus light, accent colors, plastics, and rubbers. Right now they're just flat colors, but we're going to bake them into a map, and in Substance Designer we're going to be able to assign different details to different sections. So most of the panel, as you can see, is this light gray color. I'm thinking it could be a painted metal. I also wanted a contrasting darker version of the same material, so the second gray color, the middle gray, is also painted metal. The darkest color that you see here, I was thinking it could be all metal, maybe like a stainless steel. And then the yellow and the blue, they're gonna be accent colors. So these details really pop out, but I wanted to use them sparingly in the model. In Substance Designer, we're not going to be texturing a long rectangle, but instead, we're going to texture two squares. In order to export the colors, I created a square plane underneath the bottom half of the model and the top half as well. I'm going to show you how to bake our material selections into this plane in 3D Max. With the plane selected, go to the Render to Texture dialog, and then go to the Projection Mapping section and select Pig, and select all of the high poly models. In order to straighten the cage, we need to go to the projection modifier and then reset the cage. Once it's straight, we can move it so it's above the high poly. With the projection setup complete, we can add a map. Let's choose the Arnold Albedo. This map is going to contain all of our colors without any shadows or lighting. I'm going to go ahead and choose 4K. To make sure our render does not have reflections, I'm going to open the material editor and go through every material that is being used and lower the index of reflection to 1. If the index of reflection is above 1, I've noticed some minor reflections and artifacts in the final render. And here is our final render. You need to do the same for the other panels as well. Let's export our models from 3D Max. First, on the side view, I'm checking the heights of every panel. I'm trying to make the peaks, or the highest point of every panel, about the same. This way, the color ranges in our height map are going to be consistent. I'm going to export 3 models. The first one is the high poly models, and then the lower poly plane needs to be exported individually. Feel free to pause the video for the export settings. In Substance Designer, go to Resources, right-click and link the 3D models. Also link the albedo maps that we made from 3D Max. Right-click on one of the planes and select Bake Model Information, and then add High Definition Model while selecting the high poly models that we imported from 3D Max. Under the size, I'm gonna choose 8K. I want the highest definition that I can render in order to extract all of the details. Now we can add all of the maps that we need. In this case, I need the AO, height, normal, and curvature. And make sure the frontal value is set to 0.06. The frontal value can vary depending on the size of your model. The goal is that nothing is cropped off in the final textures.
And these are our textures. Now we can create the alpha mask for each color. To do that, let's start off by creating a new graph, and I'm gonna name it alpha masks. And to this, let's drop in our new albedo maps. Let's start off with the one from the top. Dragging the pin, let's select the color to mask node, and we need to make 5 copies, so each one represents one of our colors. Make sure the mask range is set to 1 and the mask softness is at 0. Now we need to sample the colors from our albedo mask. On the first mask, I'm gonna sample the light gray. The second mask is gonna have that middle gray, and the third is gonna have the dark gray. The fourth is gonna be that accent color yellow, and the last one is the teal. By double clicking on our masks, we can see that each color is isolated properly. Now I want to create an output for every one of these colors. So the output on the top, let's change the usage to mask. And then on the output name, I'm just gonna name it Trim A Panel A. Let's duplicate the output so we have one for each color to mask. With 4 more copies, let's connect them individually to each mask. Now we can rename the identifiers. The second one can be Trim A Panel B. The third one can be Trim A Full Metal. The fourth one can be Trim A Accent A. And the last one can be Trim A Accent B. With all of this complete, we can duplicate the 4 colors on top and plug them in to the second albedo map. The second albedo map does not have the accent B. It does not use the teal. So we need to go through all of the outputs and rename them. So this is just going to be Trim B on each of the outputs. That is Trim B, Panel A, Panel B, Full Metal, and Accent A. We can double check and see that all of our masks are working. Create a new substance graph. In my case, I called it Trim A, and it has the PBR outputs. This graph corresponds to the panels that are on the top half. Therefore, let's drop in the normal map, the height map, and the AO and plug them in. To the height map, I'm adding an auto levels. This way, it has more contrast. In an empty area to the left, you can drop in your alpha masks, the substance graph that we were working on a few moments ago. We can also drop in the Trim A albedo texture. Let's start by creating 4 uniform colors and adding them to the scene. And we can start sampling colors from the albedo texture. We're gonna change these colors later on, but for now, let's just plug them in. On the first uniform color, I'm sampling the light gray. Change the bottom 2 uniform colors to grayscale. Those correspond to the roughness. Now let's blend the uniform colors on the top using the Trim A Panel A alpha. And we can do the same with the roughness colors as well. We're combining our colors with black. This way we can keep things separate and add the resulting colors together. So let's put a frame on all of these nodes and call them Panel A, Color and Roughness. Let's duplicate this entire frame and call it Panel B, Color and Roughness. And we need to do a few things. We need to replace the opacity mask and plug it in to the second alpha, the Panel B alpha, and that is going to be plugged into both the color and the roughness. To the Panel B uniform color, we can just sample the middle gray from the albedo texture on the left. And then we can change our roughness color to be lighter. This way, this panel is rougher, not as reflective as the first panel. Let's duplicate this entire frame and call it Metal, Color, and Roughness. The color for this metal is going to be different. We're not going to sample it from the albedo texture because that one is too dark.
So I'm applying a much brighter color for now. And for the roughness, let's make it darker. This way the metals are more reflective than the painted metals that we already made. Let's repeat the process for the alpha and plug in the third mask. And now let's duplicate this entire frame to create the first accent color. I'm gonna leave the roughness as is, as I do want this one to be more reflective. But for the first uniform color, I'm gonna sample the first accent color. As you can see, the frame is called Accent A, Color and Roughness. I'm duplicating this frame again for the second accent color, and that's gonna be our teal. And after the colors are plugged in, I'm going to replace all of the alphas. So please go ahead and plug in the appropriate alphas to each frame. I'm going to delete the albedo texture on the left as I don't need to sample from it anymore. It's time to blend in everything together. To blend it in, let's drag an output from the first blended color. I'm using the Alt key in order to create points as I go. This way the graph is easier to read and clean. We're combining Panel A and Panel B colors on the new blend node and change the blending mode to add. And we can do exactly the same with the roughness colors from the Panel A and Panel B. We're gonna be working our way towards the right, adding colors as we go. By dragging pins from our previous blends, we can create new blends. To these, we can add the metal colors and the metal roughness. We follow this by repeating the same process for accent color A and accent color B, making sure that everything is set to add. Let's give this graph a little more space by moving the nodes around. To see the results in 3D, I'm gonna plug in the uniform colors that we just made to the base color and the roughness. The last thing we're gonna do for this section is plug in the metallic mask directly into the metalness output. One of the great things about building the trim this way is that we're gonna texture the top half of our trim, but then we're just gonna switch the masks around and create the bottom half, and it's gonna be an automatic process. Let's continue by adding the edge wear. First, we need to make more space. And then drag the normal AO and height towards the right of the uniform colors. We're gonna be sampling from these to create the edge wear. I try to avoid diagonal lines that cut through the graph, so I'm just gonna be adding some points and making these lines more horizontal. We could have created more copies of these maps. The reason I just wanna have one of each is because when we start creating the second trim, we can just replace one map. Let's start working on the noise for the edge wear. Let's add a moisture noise and change the scale to 3. And to this, we can add a quantized grayscale and change the steps to 5. To the result, we add a non-uniform directional warp grayscale, and we plug in the quantize to all 3 pins. And to adjust the contrast, we can add a histogram scan and change the position to 0.42 and the contrast to 0.03. And you can see the end result is the moisture noise, but with more contrast, steps, it looks more patchy. Imagine this to be the breakup of the paint on the painted metal. Let's duplicate these nodes and change the scale of the moisture noise to 5. And this way, the topmost nodes are gonna be a smaller noise. We can frame them and name them.
Let's now generate AO from our height map, and we can change the height scale to 0.03, making the AO have thinner details. And then we can multiply the AO we just generated with the one that we baked from the models. We do this by creating a blend node and multiplying them both together. Now we can blend in the large noise by dragging a pin from the output and then plugging in the noise in the foreground. The way we're gonna blend it together is by changing the blend type to add and then changing the opacity to 0.15. We're gonna be blending the noise again, but this time we're gonna keep the blending mode at copy and use an opacity of 0.1. In the future, when you're fine-tuning the edgeware, you can always go back and change the opacity on these values. It's gonna make it either noisier or cleaner. This is the moment that we start envisioning the edgeware. So let's invert the result and then adjust the levels. The levels we need to use to create more contrast. So I'm dragging the pin on the right towards the center. I want this noisy edge map to be thinner, so what I'm going to do, I'm gonna blend it with the AO that is detailed. First, we need to invert that AO and plug it into the foreground and set the result to multiply. To keep things organized, we can frame the section, and I'm just gonna call it metal edges. Let's start to add some scratches to the result. To do this, we can introduce a scratch generator. And to the spline number, I'm gonna put 150. And the spline scale can be set to 0.15. Let's drag a blend from the result of the edgeware. And then we can plug in the scratches to the foreground and blend it in using max lighten with an opacity of 0.5. Let's introduce a histogram scan to adjust the contrast. So I'm gonna set the position to 0.5 and the contrast to 0.31. I'm realizing that I'm losing a lot of the noise. So what I'm gonna do to fix this is go back into the final blend of the edgeware and change the blending mode to copy and opacity to 0.5. This is gonna restore some of the noise and also keep the detail of that thin AO. We can frame these three nodes and call them large scratches. Let's copy the scratch generator in order to create the small scratches. Changing the spline number to 2000 and the scale to 0.06. This is going to give us very thin and small scratches. We're going to blend them in two steps. First, we're going to blend it with the result of the large scratches and setting that to multiply. This drastically gets rid of most of the small scratches. And then we're gonna blend it again with the same map, but this time use a blending mode of max lighten. The end result is that the small scratches are only on the edges. Right now I'm noticing that the scratches that are small are barely showing up, so I'm introducing a levels in order to increase the brightness of the original map. And changing the blending mode from max lighten to add fixes the issue. But I also want to control how much of the scratches do I introduce. So I'm gonna flip the pins and make sure that the scratches are plugged in to the foreground and not the background. And this way, when we lower the opacity, the scratches are the ones that disappear. The final opacity is set to 0.5, and we can frame the result as small scratches. Substance Designer comes in with its own metal edgeware solution, but what we can do to make things look more interesting is plug in their solution with our maps that we just made to create a combined result. So go ahead and add the metal edgeware generator and plug in 3 maps. It wants the normal, the curvature, and the AO. We baked these at the beginning. I want to use this solution to create very thin and detailed edges. So once everything is plugged in, change the wear level to 0.5, the wear contrast to 0.9, and the grunge amount to 0.3. Right now these edges are almost equally distributed throughout the model. So what I want to do is use a mask to break things up. So let's blend in the small noise and plug it into the foreground and set the result to multiply. And you can see now that the edges are broken up. Let's add these detail edges to our previous result. So blending them in, we can change the blending mode to max lighten. So I'm putting a frame on these 3 nodes and calling them detail edgeware. Now it's time to use our edgeware to change the final outputs. Grabbing a pin from the final base color, we're gonna create a new blend. And then we're gonna plug in the edgeware to the alpha. And on the foreground of this new blend, we can plug in the uniform color that corresponds to the metal directly. And the end result is that the edges are gonna be using the metal color. Now we have our new blended result. Let's plug it to the output. We need to do exactly the same thing with the roughness. So let's drag a blend from the latest version of the roughness. Into this new blend, we need to plug in the metal edgeware to the alpha. And then we grab that uniform color that corresponds to the metallic roughness and plug it in the foreground. Now we have a roughness map that has more reflections on the broken edges, and we can plug in the result into the roughness output. We want our metal edges to change the metalness map. So what we can do is create a new blend node in thin air, and then take the connection that is currently plugged in to the metalness output by holding shift and plug it in to the background of this new blend. Plug in the metal edgeware to the foreground and then change the blending mode to max lighten. The result should be plugged in to the output. Let's frame these 3 nodes to keep things organized. Congratulations, you've laid the foundation of the metal edgeware. The next stage, we're gonna be adding water damage. For this section, I want to start off by creating a mask that has random colors in different panels. From the panel A mask, let's drag an edge detect and change the edge width to 1.5 and the roundness to 1. Duplicate this node and plug it into the 3rd mask, the one that belongs to the metals. Now let's create a shape and leave it at the defaults. We just need to change the scale to 0.99. Let's multiply all these 3 nodes together. So let's drag a blend, multiply the bottom 2, and then drag another blend and multiply that with the top. We essentially have outlines on the entire square and also most of the panels. And to the end result, let's add a flood fill. And to that, we can add flood fill to random color. This is a mask that we're going to be using to distort the water damage. Let's frame this entire section as random colors. You're going to see very soon how we can use this mask to distort the water damage. It will go from evenly dripping on the whole texture to something that feels like it's interacting with the panels. Let's drop in two of the noises. The first one's gonna be the grunge map 006, and the second one is gonna be the grunge leaks. And to the result, we can add the vector warp grayscale. This is where we plug in our random colors. So let's drag a pin from the vector map and drag it all the way to the random color section. By dragging the intensity slider on the warp, you can see how the water damage is distorting based on the sizes of the panels. Let's adjust two of these noises so we can get two different patterns. Once you're happy with them, let's drag a pin from these results and create a gradient map. This is gonna change the mode from grayscale to color. And what I want to do is use the color to mask node. We're gonna use this to isolate a small portion of the leaks. And we have one of them plugged into each gradient map. So let's take the top one first and increase the mask range and also the softness to 1. What I want to do is create a pattern that is thin and soft and random throughout the panels. Feel free to experiment with the intensity of the vector warp as well as sampling different colors on the color to mask. This is going to drastically change the pattern overall until you find something you're happy with. I want to blend the results together, so let's drag a blend and change the blending mode to max lighten. And here, I'm noticing that the mask is really noisy and intense. Looking back at the nodes, I realized that I didn't plug in the grunge leaks, and that is the softer mask. So let's plug it in to the chain that is on the bottom. Something that I didn't do but I could recommend is to create a directional blur that goes from top to bottom if you want to make the water damage look a little more like leaks. Let's add two uniform colors and blend them together, and then plug in our mask to the alpha. I'm sampling colors to the uniform color on the top to create a bit of an algae green. This one is more on the warm side. I actually want to create two different sets of colors, so to this one, I'm gonna plug in the mask that is on the top. And let's duplicate all of these three nodes and plug in the different mask, the one that comes from the grunge leaks. We want to make these two colors different, so I'm gonna grab the one at the bottom and change it to a green that is more blue in color. Once you're happy with the two colors, you can blend them both together using Max Lighten. Now we can take these results and blend them with the color and the roughness. So dragging a pin from the color, let's create a new blend. We can plug in the colors that we just made to the foreground and the mask that is on the top to the opacity. And we can play around with the opacity of this mask to determine the intensity of the leaks. This is a node that is very important, so we're gonna come back to it eventually. My recommendation is that once you export your textures to Unreal, you can assess the details. You can determine if anything needs to be toned down or enhanced. I want this to affect the roughness but not the metalness. From my experience, the noises that are on the metalness mask are very dramatic and unreal, so I try to keep it very subtle and only introduce the things that really matter. Let's drag a blend from the roughness and then plug in our new mask to the alpha. What we want to do is create a grayscale uniform color and plug that into the foreground. The value that we set on this uniform color is going to determine the roughness of the water damage. Now we can take our final blends and plug them into the outputs. I'm looking at the 3D view and moving the light around to determine if the details are working. I'm very happy seeing how they changed the reflectivity. And the effect that it has on the color map is very subtle but present. We just finished with setting the foundation for the water damage. Now I want to organize the graph, so I'm going to create a couple of frames. To the bulk of the nodes, I'm just going to call them water damage. And to the final blending nodes, I'm just going to call them water damage blend. I'm going to isolate the uniform color that changes the roughness. This is a very important node, so I'm gonna move it down and frame it by itself. We're finished with the water damage. On the next section, we're gonna be working on the metal rust.
Going to our detail edgeware section, let's take the result from the metal edgeware generator. And then from here, we can create a blend. And then blend this with the result of the water damage. And change the blending mode to max lighten. What I want to do is create a mask that limits where the rust is going to be. Let's introduce a noise, the one that is called grunge rust fine. And blend the result with the mask that we just created. I only want the rust to be on the metal, so what I'm going to do is grab the original metal mask, drag it towards the right, and then create a new blend from this mask. We can then plug in the rust that we're making to the foreground and set the blending mode to multiply, and this is going to limit the rust to the metal parts. The main node that determines where the rust is going to be is this grunge rust fine. When we adjust the balance and the contrast, we severely limit where the rust is located. To start seeing the effect, let's make sure that the output that is coming from this mask is being set to multiply on the blending mode. I'm seeing that the mask is very sharp, so I'm just gonna add a blur HQ grayscale and blur it by a very small amount. Let's try 0.02. Feel free to continue to fine-tune the grunge rust. This mask is very important. I want to get the values tuned so I have enough rust on the metal. I want to start seeing the rust on the model, so let's add some uniform colors, 3 in total. We can add a 4th one and change it to grayscale. The 4th one is going to be the roughness that we use for the rust. Now I'm going to sample 3 different colors that represent shades of rust. I'm using 2 shades of brown that are similar and one that is more yellow. If you want to try the colors that I'm using, you can simply sample from the YouTube video. The icons and the nodes represent the colors. Let's create a new grunge rust fine so we can use it to blend the top 2 colors.
creating a new blend, we can plug it into the opacity and then plug in the colors in the foreground and background. Putting a pause on the colors, I want to create a normal map. So grabbing the mask that represents the rust, let's create a normal. And change the intensity to 0.02. Because we're using these for Unreal, I want to change the normal format to OpenGL. Let's add a normal combine. I want to plug in the rust to the foreground and a regular original normal to the background, and then we can take the result and plug it into the output. Now we can see the rust in 3D. I'm thinking I just want a very faint and subtle amount, so I'm gonna lower it even more and use 0.01 and frame the result to keep things organized. I want to start seeing the colors in 3D, so what I'm gonna do is grab the base color, create a new blend, and then plug in that yellow uniform color to the foreground. I want this to be dripping faint rust before we add the main rust on top. The mask for the dripping rust is very simple. We just need to take the rust mask and add a directional blur. We can change the angle of the blur to 90 degrees and lower the intensity to 1. Now that the mask is framed and ready, we can plug it in to the opacity. The opacity on the blend determines the rust amount. Let's set it to 0.5. Let's introduce our regular rust. So I'm going to be dragging a new blend and then using the rust that doesn't have the blur on the opacity, and then taking the rust colors that are darker and plugging them into the foreground. We can change the opacity on this blend to 0.75. This determines the amount of rust, and then plug in the result to the final output. We need to do the same for the roughness, so let's create a new blend so we can plug in the uniform color that controls the roughness. That's going to be plugged into the foreground. And then we can take that same rust mask without the blur and plug it in to the opacity. The final results can be plugged into the output. We can see on the preview that the rust is indeed affecting the roughness. I'm noticing that the water damage is too intense on the roughness, so I'm going to go back to that section in our graph, the water damage blend, and change the opacity of the roughness to 0.75. Anything beyond this point is fine-tuning. I'm thinking of adjusting the shape and the distribution of the rust, so I'm gonna go back and play around with the grunge rust fine. The balance and the contrast are very important. The random seed completely changes the rust patterns. I'm thinking of decreasing the size of the rust. We do not actually have a tiling or a scale feature on the rust, so I'm gonna expand this area of the graph so I can introduce a safe transform. On this transform, I'm gonna end up settling with a tiling value of 2 and continue adjusting the contrast and the distribution of the rust. Feel free to continue experimenting with the distribution of the rust. I'm personally going to apply a very faint amount. I just want the rust to show up on select areas of the metal, not on every edge. We can see our texture is really taking shape, and with this, we're more than halfway through the texturing process. The next module is going to be on dirt. be adding our dirt, but first let's organize our graph. The rust that we blended before needs to be framed. We can start off by dropping in a moisture noise. We're going to be using this noise to limit the amount of dirt. We can adjust the contrast of this noise using a histogram scan. I want this mask to have a lot of contrast, so I'm going to play around with the position and the contrast to make sure that the darks and the lights are very different from each other. And for the noise, I'm settling with a scale of 2. Now let's introduce the dirt generator. The generator wants a couple of inputs. The first one I'm gonna plug in is the normal map. But for that, I want to drag my nodes towards the left of the generator. Once that one's plugged in, it also wants the curvature and the AO. So we can drag them all the way to the side where we have these nodes into the generator. With everything plugged in, we're ready to start adjusting the values of the dirt. So for the dirt level, let's put 0.6. And for the dirt contrast, 0.15. And for the grunge amount, 0.1. And I'm changing the edges masking to 1. As you can see, the dirt is very faint and mainly present on the crevices. Now we're gonna multiply the dirt with the mask that we previously made in order to break it up. Now let's blend it in with the colors. The process is very similar to what we have been doing throughout the other modules. Creating a new blend from the previous result, we can plug in the dirt to the opacity. And now let's add a new uniform color to represent the dirt color, and we can plug it in to the foreground. Feel free to sample from the swatch if you want to try out the same color. Now let's take the result and plug it in to the output. This way we see the results on the 3D model. Now we can proceed with the same steps for the roughness, creating a new grayscale uniform color. We can frame it to keep things organized and then blend it in with our previous roughness using the same dirt mask. Let's frame this section to keep things organized. I'm thinking of having the dirt affect the metalness. This is something that we need to do with care because it has a huge impact in Unreal. If we add too much, we can simply go back and lower the blending. I'm gonna create a new level adjustment to the mask from the dirt that we were using before. And to this level adjustment, I want to clamp it in. Let's create a new blend mode from the level adjustments. And then what we can do is unplug it from the background and move it into the foreground. On the background, I want to plug in the metalness that we're using on the output. We can use the opacity on this new blend node in order to determine how much does the dirt affect the metalness. This is a very important node, and most likely we'll need to play around with it when we see our results in Unreal. The blending node is set to subtract, and then the opacity is set to 0.5. You can see on the preview that it's taking the white metal sections and making them darker. But like I said, maybe a better value could be 0.1 or 0.001. It depends on Unreal. And with this, we're done with the dirt. We can proceed to the final touch-ups. These touch-ups primarily consist with color updates and changes to the intensities of the features. And I'm starting these updates on the water damage. I'm putting a color swatch on the screen, so if you want to sample the colors, you can go ahead. Besides changing the colors of the water damage, I'm also updating the opacity to 0.15 and changing the opacity for the roughness to 0.6. Now I'm gonna go back to the beginning of our graph. This is where we have the uniform colors that control the albedo colors and also the roughnesses. I'm gonna update these according to the swatch that's on the screen. Make that accent A color metallic. This way, this yellow feature is gonna look a little more like gold. In order to do that, I'm gonna grab a pin from the mask that corresponds to the accent 1 and then drop a blending node. This change should take place before the dirt. This way, the dirt can also affect this gold feature. And to this, I need to blend our previous metallic mask and change the blending mode to max lighten. The end result is that the metalness mask is gonna have that circle feature as white. I'm going to frame this specific blending node just in case we change our mind and want to revert it back to the way it was. This is something that I like doing at the end. It adds more color variety and dimension to the albedo color. So first, we need to take the normal map and then use a curvature smooth. Keep the normal format consistent. This way, the curvature smooth does not look like it's inverted. Let's convert this curvature smooth to a color by using a gradient map, and this way we can blend it in with our colors. Taking the previous version of our colors, we can drag in a new blending node and then plug in the result of the curvature smooth. Set it to overlay. When you plug this into the output, you can immediately see it has more contrast and more definition. And just like the other pieces of art that we made, it needs to be framed. As I was checking the maps, I noticed that the roughness for that golden detail needs to be more reflective. So I'm gonna go back to the beginning of the graph and change the roughness for the accent A to be much darker. I'm gonna duplicate the roughness output and then rename it to dirt mask. And to this output, I want to plug in the dirt mask. This kind of mask can be really handy if you want to paint in the dirt with vertex colors in a program like Unreal. It can also be really handy if you want to paint other things like rust. And we're finally done with the top of the trim. The bottom will be much easier because we're just going to replace some of our texture assignments. In order to create the lower trim, I'm going to start off by duplicating the substance graph and renaming it to trim B. And now we can double click on it and open it. So what I'm going to do is drop in the maps that we baked for trim B and replace the connections. So by shift dragging on these points, I can take the connections from one of the nodes and move it to the new one. And with that, all of the connections of those maps are replaced. The lower trim doesn't use the secondary accent color, so what I want to do is disconnect this entire section. And the previous section is the one that needs to create the connections that impact the texture. And the last thing that we need to do is shift drag the connections from the top to the corresponding masks on the bottom. Let's give it a few moments and we can see that the texture is updated on the preview. We finished the lower trim. It's finally time to export our maps into Unreal. Let's create a new graph and call it Export Maps. I'm going to use the PBR preset. Into this, we can drop in trim A and trim B. Let's create a tile generator color. I want to combine these two textures. Let's update the X amount to 1 and the Y amount to 2. And on the pattern, let's choose image input and change the pattern input to 2. And change the output sizes to 1. So let's connect trim A to pattern input 1 and trim B to pattern input 2. And then we can see on the preview that our textures are stacked, but they're squashed. To fix this, let's use a safe transform color and change the width to -1. On the bottom of the node, we can see that the resolution has been updated. Feel free to change these values so you can use the resolution that you desire. I'm going to go with 4K x 8K for now. We can duplicate the nodes above and plug in the normal maps. Now we need to do exactly the same thing for the grayscale maps. But instead of using the tile generator color, we can use the tile generator grayscale. Similarly, we update the X and Y amounts, the pattern input numbers, and the pattern input type. And now we're plugging in the roughness, changing the resolution on the safe transform grayscale. And we can duplicate this and plug in the metalness, the height, the AO, and the dirt mask. As I was checking my maps, I noticed that the height map was flipped, so I'm gonna change the connections. Let's add frames to all of these sections. In the future, if we make more trims, we can easily plug things in. Let's go ahead and plug these in to the final output so we can export our maps. For the dirt, I'm gonna duplicate the AO output, change the usage, and update the label and identifier. I want to create a special map that I'm going to be using in Unreal. So let's make some space on the output so we can duplicate one of the color outputs. This map is going to contain a roughness, metalness, and AO. Duplicating the color map, we can change the label. I'm changing the identifier to SRM, which stands for Specular Roughness Metalness. It can also be labeled as ARM, AO Roughness Metalness. What matters is that you know which map is where when you plug things in Unreal. Also, if you create new trims and new textures, that they are consistent. Let's add an RGB merge so we can create our new map. And plug in the AO to the R, roughness to G, and metalness to B. If you plan on using the height map in Unreal, you can plug it into the alpha. I want to set this on the side for now. Let's create some exports for the masks. So let's drop in the graph that contains the masks. And then we can copy one of the tile generators and save transforms, the ones that are grayscale. We're combining the panel A outputs. And then we can duplicate the whole section for panel B. As well as the metalness, accent A and accent B. Making sure that we plug in the outputs correctly. All these maps are going to be really helpful in Unreal. We're going to be using them to tint the color. For accent B, we just need to disconnect the pattern input 2, as we do not have that color on the bottom of our trim. In order to export these masks, we're going to be using the RGB merge, so let's copy the one that we just made. And to the first one, we can plug in panel A to R, panel B to G, and the metal section to B. We can duplicate the RGB merge and then plug in accent A to R, accent B to G. Right now the blue channel doesn't have any connections, so I'm thinking of exporting the dirt mask into the B. I accidentally plugged it into the alpha, but I'm gonna fix that soon. I'm gonna plug in the RGB merge to the proper outputs. Let's plug in the SRM. And then we can duplicate this output and move it towards the bottom. And these new outputs we're gonna be using to export our masks. I'm thinking of just labeling them Masks A and Masks B. gonna make sure that the dirt mask is plugged in properly to the blue channel. The last thing that we need to do on this graph is create a uniform color and change the type to grayscale. The color should be white. And we can plug this in to the alphas of our RGB merge. Right now I'm not using the height map in Unreal, so I'm just gonna export that with the white on the alpha. Let's right click on the Export Maps graph and select Export Outputs. From here, I'm gonna choose Targa, TGA, and select all of the maps to export, making sure that they're set to sRGB. And here are the final maps. As you can see, everything exported correctly. Thank you for joining me so far. We created our sci-fi models from scratch. Then we made our trim texture set in Substance Designer. On the next video, we'll continue the process of creating an environment like the one that you see on the background. I hope to see you there, and thank you for watching.